What we are looking at right now, for viewers just joining us, you are looking live at Canadian Forces Base Trenton in southeastern Ontario. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will join dignitaries, military officials, and of course families and friends, all paying tribute to 6 Canadian military members killed last week in a helicopter crash off the coast of Greece. In this time, as Jacqueline was mentioning, of COVID-19, we're expecting a ceremony unlike any we've seen before. No troops will be standing shoulder to shoulder. No one, in fact, will be standing shoulder to shoulder except perhaps families and pallbearers carrying the only casket for Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra, as you are looking at the aircraft as it approaches the hangar on the tarmac of CFB Trenton and the sad sight of those hearses that are there. Here are the victims of that crash. They are, from the top left, Captain Kevin Hagan, Sub-Lieutenant Cobra, and to her right, Captain Brendan Ian McDonald. On the bottom left, Captain Maxime Miron-Morin, Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, and Master Corporal Matthew Cousins. And that was Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra paying tribute to the victims of the Nova Scotia shooting. Cobra shared this video on Facebook of her performance aboard the HMCS Fredericton on April 24th, 1 week before she died in the helicopter crash. The military is continuing its efforts to find out why the Cyclone helicopter crashed. And the CBC's Evan Dyer is tracking those developments, and he joins us now as we continue to look at the live images. We will continue to look at the live images, and this is the scene that we are looking at right now. There is the Canadian military aircraft as it gets ready for this repatriation ceremony, and there are the 6 hearses. And so, Evan, what's the status of the investigation at this point?
Well, Andrew, the National Research Council of Canada is going to examine the 2 flight data recorders, that is to say the black boxes, the voice recorder and the electronic data recorder, both of which are designed to detach from this helicopter if it's involved in a crash and float. They were retrieved and will be examined here in Ottawa. The helicopter itself, of course, hit very deep water. It went down in one of the deepest parts of the Mediterranean, which will, of course, complicate things somewhat. The data recorders, however, would contain information, including any conversations between the aircrew in the minutes leading up to the crash. They would include information about the aircraft's altitude and attitude, the direction it was traveling in. They would be able to track, investigators through those black boxes would be able to track the exact flight path of the aircraft, including how it went down and how it hit the water. So there's a lot of information to be had there. But generally, investigations involve a mix of data recorders and wreckage. And the wreckage is really, because of the depth of that part of the Mediterranean, the wreckage is really where the problem is. We've already heard those waters described as being about 3,000 meters deep, 2 miles deep, in other words. So recovering that is going to be quite a challenge. In the meantime, the helicopters are on an operational pause, which is different from a grounding. But we did hear General Jonathan Vance, the Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Armed Forces, saying that they want to make sure that there's not a fleet-wide problem in these helicopters before resuming operations. There have been issues with a civilian version of this helicopter in the past, and of course there was that famous crash involving an S-92 Sikorsky. That involved a gearbox issue, a gearbox running dry. We don't believe that that's the focus, however, of the investigation in this case, but still waiting to hear more details as it goes on.
Here is a sight to be seen, Evan, as we're just looking at this. I mean, this is just, there have been a lot of tragedies in this country, but this kind of just, punctuates it, if you will. There we can see members of the Canadian Armed Forces as well as families that are gathering there as they await for this repatriation ceremony to take place. And as we suspected, they are wearing masks because of the COVID-19 pandemic that is happening all at the same time as this. And we can see members of the military getting ready for that repatriation ceremony that is taking place. Evan, do we know more, or what do we know in terms of how this is going to take place over the next hour or so, just generally speaking?
Well, we're expecting to see one group of people who won't be wearing masks, and that's the pallbearers who will wear gloves but won't be wearing masks. The family members have been asked to observe social distancing rules, and everything appears to be set up to keep people fairly distant from one another. And of course, the Prime Minister is there too, and I think we can expect him to speak to the families too.
Yes, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is there in CFB Trenton, as well as we see members of the military setting up getting ready for this repatriation ceremony that's taking place. It was 6 members of the Canadian Armed Forces that were on board that Cyclone helicopter that crashed 1 week ago. They were part of Operation Reassurance. Here they are again. And Evan, as we know, in this ceremony right now, there will only be one casket. We do know that the military has said that the remains of another person among the 6 is also coming back, has arrived in Canada, but they have not released that individual's identity.
Right. I think that they would want to be able to identify those remains, obviously, before going ahead with this kind of ceremony. But yes, we do understand the remains of one other person have been recovered. And this loss, 6 people at once, is the biggest loss for the Canadian Armed Forces since 2007 in one incident. The last time that anything like this happened was in combat in Afghanistan. And it's been 13 years since the Canadian Armed Forces have sustained a loss like this in one single incident.
Yeah, unfortunately, I remember that day. I was also here when that news came in, and that was certainly, it was an Easter weekend in April back in 2007, and that was a significant moment just in terms of it being so very deadly as this helicopter crash. The circumstances, of course, were different in Afghanistan than what we have seen happen in the Ionian Sea, but this is the scene that is taking place right now. Evan, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the Prime Minister is going to be there. Do we know what kind of role he is going to have in this ceremony, or is it more of we certainly see him speak every day about the COVID-19 pandemic? And let me just, let's just listen for a bit. I want to actually bring in Tim Dunn now. He's part of our coverage. He is a retired major who spent more than 30 years with the Canadian Armed Forces. His deployments included NATO and UN missions. Currently, he's a professor of communication at Mount St. Vincent University. So, Tim, we're looking at the Guard March. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what we're watching right now?
Well, I can't see it on my screen, regrettably, Andrew. But what happens here is that, of course, the people are bringing the casket and then the headdresses on cushions out from the aircraft to be placed in the vehicles to be brought into to Toronto along the Highway of Heroes.
And can you tell us a little bit about this moment in terms of, the sadness, but also the importance of repatriating members of the Canadian military in these moments?
Well, repatriation of remains is a reasonably modern thing. Prior to 1972, when a service member died overseas, the remains were left overseas. It's only in 1972 they changed that and started bringing remains back home. It's important because not only is it important for the family, but it's also important for the people they served with and served alongside, and the other members of the military to see that they are brought home and they're laid to rest in their home country.
I'm going to pick up some other guys walking. I'm going to zoom in and pick them up, guys.
And Tim, appreciate you walking us through this. We're just going to watch and listen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And the CBC's Evan Dyer is also watching along with us as we see the quarter guard there march towards the aircraft, and they are now standing waiting for the remains and the service headdresses of those 6 Canadian Air Forces members to be removed from the aircraft. This will be the moment that these remains and service headdresses return to Canada for the first time. Obviously, a sad moment once again in the history of this country, as this is being marked as members of that aircraft walk off that plane in order to set up the ceremony that is taking place. And so, Evan, just tell us more about what we're seeing and what we're expecting to see over the next hour or so.
Well, as we heard, the headgear is going to have to represent 5 of the 6 people lost, because they only have fully identified remains in the case of Sub-Lieutenant Cobra. But we expect to see 4 Air Force headgear or PCAPs and 1 for the Navy to represent the services that the 5 other members were involved with. They'll be put into the hearses, and I expect the families will have a chance at that point to approach, although with social distancing rules in place, it's hard to say what aspects of this ceremony would be changed from what we would normally see. One that we can say for sure that will be changing probably is the trip to Toronto, because the Highway of Heroes, which used to have overpasses lined with people during the Afghan war, we may see some people there, but we have heard already the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, encouraging people not to come out in person for this ceremony. Force is saying, if you must come to Trenton, if you want to come to Trenton, do, but please respect social distancing. But the province certainly encouraging people not to line the highways as we used to see. So it's going to be a ceremony that's going to be, like everything nowadays, affected somewhat by the prevailing pandemic. But the military is trying as hard as it can to follow the normal protocols and show as much respect as it always does in these cases. And I think, we were just hearing about how repatriation changed over time. And of course, everybody remembers that our large war cemeteries, the biggest war cemeteries, the war cemeteries from the world wars, are over in Europe and in Hong Kong and in various other theaters of war where Canadian forces fought. But, there is a sort of an unspoken contract, and actually not so unspoken. It's also something that is taught to people in staff college and so on, that, the military part of the contract when you sign up is that the military will make an effort to recover your remains, will make an effort to ensure that you're buried properly, and that your grave is tended. And that's been a commitment that Canada's been trying to keep up ever since the First World War, really, and even before. So this is a ceremony that has a lot of significance for military members. It's not only sort of the final goodbye, but the final thank you too, and a chance to say, that the military will make an effort, even if it can't save its members, and it knows it does lose members both in training and in combat. It will make an effort to recover their remains and see that they're treated properly.
And it is something that we definitely have seen before, but it feels as though it has been a while that we have seen a repatriation ceremony like this. It was in recent years, mostly during Canada's time in Afghanistan, but that time has ended. So this is another repatriation ceremony that will be familiar to Canadians, unfortunately, but it is happening again. This time is a very different time, as we see there members of the Canadian Armed Forces awaiting the casket and the remains of the service headdresses of the headgear of the other members to be removed from that aircraft. We did see, Evans, some military members walk off of that aircraft, and I am wondering, I'm not certain, I'm just wondering if they are from HMCS Fredericton. I don't know whether we know that or not, or whether we should assume that or not, but that is just something I'm wondering about, at least.
Well, we know where the Fredericton is. The Fredericton has docked in the port of Taranto, Italy, and certainly some of the crew members, we believe, are being interviewed by the Flight Safety Investigation Team, which has traveled to Taranto because since the crash, it has emerged that this aircraft went into the ocean fairly close to the ship, and that was witnessed by several people on deck, we believe, and so those people and their witness statements now become part of that investigation. So certainly some of the crew members would be involved in that, in the debriefing about this incident back in Taranto. But since the ship is in port in Italy, it's quite possible that other members were able to escort some of their shipmates back home.
And Tim Dunn is back with us now, the retired Major who has been part of our coverage. And so, Major, tell us a little bit more about what it is that we're seeing.
Well, you've seen the ramp ceremony where the remain, the casket and the headdresses of the people who died in this incident are being removed to be placed in the cars. When this was done in Afghanistan, there was a similar service done at the airfield in Kandahar, and then the aircraft brought the remains back to Canada, where they were placed in the vehicles, and now these vehicles will go to Toronto along the Highway of Heroes.
And Major, is this a poignant moment? Because we also know that there was a ceremony that took place on board the HMCS Fredericton as it was heading to port in Italy, where it is now docked. And as Evan has been mentioning, there are members of the HMCS Fredericton that are being interviewed about the crash because it was within sight of HMCS Fredericton as the helicopter was returning to the vessel. Is this a poignant moment when the plane lands and the remains return back to Canada?
It is very poignant. Also keep in mind that this is the first time that the families will be reunited with the service members since the accident, and so now only one is present, but there are representations of the other 5 as well. And so it's also normal in these situations for the military to provide escorts for the remains, and that's probably what you're seeing as well. That these service people and their represented and the material that represents them are also being escorted by their colleagues from the ship.
And Evan, as we await for this ceremony to take place, tell us more about the investigation into what happened.
Well, the current most important avenues of investigation are the flight data recorders and the witnesses, because investigators have those. The wreckage, on the other hand, is much more of a problem because of where this helicopter went down in the Hellenic Trench in the Ionian Sea, the deepest part of the Mediterranean Ocean. So if you imagine an investigation usually having at least 2 elements, wreckage and flight data recorders, in this case, they're missing one of those. But they do have witnesses who've already spoken about what they saw, and so they already know some important details. It appears, first of all, that there was no Mayday call, which is probably a significant fact, and it also appears that this helicopter was on an approach back to the Fredericton and quite close to landing when it went into the ocean. So since crew members on deck saw it go down, it might be reasonable to assume or to hope that they could shed some light on how it went down, how it hit the ocean. Did it appear to just simply trend into the ocean? Did its motors appear to cut, and did it drop? We don't know how much of a view they had, how much they'll be able to illuminate investigators on that topic, but we do know that investigators are speaking to crew members in Toronto, Italy, so hopefully they'll be able to shed some more details on it. And then the electronic part of the investigation will take place here in Ottawa at the National Research Council. That's going to involve the flight data recorder and the voice recorder. And it's going to be that jigsaw puzzle of trying to assemble the witness statements with the electronic data and whatever pieces of wreckage were recovered. And we know that some debris was recovered from what was considered a pretty wide debris field in the Mediterranean. There was a very intensive search that began immediately after the ship hit the water, and it involved ships not only the Fredericton, but ships of the Italian and Turkish navies as well. So all of that will be pieced together as carefully
And
as it
just
can be.
sorry to interrupt, Evan, but I just want to let our viewers know, I believe that is the Prime Minister as well as other members. Yep, there is Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and as you can see, they are wearing masks during this COVID-19 pandemic that is taking place in this country, around the world right now. But we are seeing members of the military as well as the Prime Minister, the National Defense Minister at this repatriation ceremony that is taking place at CFB Trenton, and they are wearing masks, a sign of these times. Major, just your thoughts on what we're seeing right now.
Well, what the presence of the defense minister, the prime minister, the chief of defense staff, and other personnel, other senior personnel of the military, just indicates just how serious this matter is. That the death of service members in Canada of the Canadian military is always seen as a significant event, and there is a certain amount of dignity and ceremony that goes with their repatriation. As I said before, this is the first time that the families will have been reunited with anything to do with the deceased since they left Canada, and I imagine that this is going to be a very emotional moment for them as well.
And can you, from what you're seeing, Major, do you want to help me identify? I believe that would be the Chief of Defense Staff there as well. It's harder to recognize and identify people when they're wearing masks in these moments. But obviously, we know that is the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, the Defense Minister, Harjit Sajjan, and I believe that would be the Chief of Defense Staff.
That's right, and probably next to him, to his left, will be the chief warrant officer of the Canadian Forces, and I would suspect that next to his left is the defense minister.
And also Evan Dyer is also watching, and you can just walk us through what we're seeing, Evan.
I see also the deputy defense minister standing there too in a black dress, who is herself was in the Navy and is actually also, I believe, married to a naval officer and is the daughter of a naval officer, and kind of a living reminder that the Navy is quite a small family in Canada. And I believe we may also be seeing the commander of the Air Force there. I mean, certainly I would expect him to be there.
And that's an important point, right, Evan, because this is different areas of the Canadian Armed Forces
that's right.
that died in this crash.
Yes, it's all aviation.
And we lost a little bit of Evan there. I'm sure we'll get him back. But Major, just your thoughts on how this has. Is it unusual that a single incident would affect different areas of the Canadian Armed Forces?
No, not at all. We've had similar situations in Afghanistan. Craig Blake was a petty officer and a Navy diver, and he was one of the fatalities in Afghanistan as well. So the Canadian military operates on the basis of shared expertise. So it's a combined effort, and their skills are not always with one service or the other. You can have situations where the Navy or the Air Force will have a particular set of skills that are required by the Army, and then they will be assigned. The military operates on unlimited liability and universality of service. So that means that you don't, whether you're in the Army, Navy, or Air Force, it doesn't mean that you will stay within that service for your whole career, or even that you won't be involved in various operations with the Army or the Air Force or the Navy, regardless of your uniform color. If you have a skill set that's needed, you will be called up to provide that service.
And we are just, for our viewers that are just joining us, we are watching as the repatriation ceremony for the 6 members of the Canadian Armed Forces who died in a cyclone helicopter that crashed in the Ionian Sea as it was approaching the HMCS Fredericton last week, is taking place at CFB Trenton in Ontario. In attendance the family members as well as the military family of those that have fallen, the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the Chief of Defense Staff, the Deputy Chief of Defense Staff, as well as other members of the military, as we watch and wait for this repatriation ceremony to take place. Major, how do the challenges of this pandemic affect a ceremony such as this? We can see that there is social distancing there taking place on the tarmac. A small, I mean, not, I'm sure it's not something of great concern.
No, but everyone is maintaining a certain distance, safe distance from each other, and those that aren't are wearing masks. This is the first time I have seen this in my lifetime, and so it's just an indication of the times in which we live.
And there is only one body recovered, that of Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra. The remains of one other person, as I've been mentioning, have been recovered but not yet identified. So what happens if and when the remains of the others are recovered, Major?
I really don't know. This is a service that's intended to represent all 6 members, the 2 members of the Royal Canadian Navy and the 4 of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I don't know what will happen from this point forward if the others are recovered. I would not be surprised to see this repeated.
And what questions, Major, do you have about what happened to that chopper?
Well, of course, the same as everybody has. What happened? It's a brand new helicopter. It's this is the first accident of its kind with the first loss of a helicopter. It's brand new. It's in use in Fredericton for the duration of the deployment, and so that's one aspect. I'd like to know what happened. I think everybody would like to know what happened. It's not just a matter of equipment. It's what happens to the future down the road. Is there a class problem? Is there a problem with this one aircraft? Was it pilot error? Was it something else? There are a lot of question marks about this. We know that it's got the aircraft it replaced, the Sea King, had over 500,000 hours on the fleet, and so it's I think quite a comment on for the people who maintain these aircraft to see them fly as reliably as they do. So to see one that crashes unexpectedly like this and with the loss of life means that there's going to be quite an intensive investigation, I suspect, and there will be a lot of questions asked, and there will be quite a comprehensive report done about this.
And Evan, you were giving us an update moments ago about the status of the investigation. I believe that you said the flight data recorder is in Ottawa. Is that what you said?
That's right. Yes, both flight data recorders, both voice and the cockpit data or the instrument data are in the National Research Council in Ottawa. And indeed, it's going to be an investigation that has to answer a pretty difficult question, which is, as we just heard, over 500,000 hours with the fleet. And General Vance said that the Cyclone had 9,000 hours with the fleet. That's really not that much when you consider the safety record of the much criticized Sea King over all of those years. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that there's a systemic problem or a fleet-wide problem. It doesn't mean that any such problem is going to be identified during this operational pause. This may just be a very unfortunate accident coming fairly early in the life of this aircraft. And it must be said that the military has been happy with the Cyclone. They've been actually more than satisfied with it, according to General Vance. They waited a long time to get it. I think everybody knows the story of how complicated and problematic the procurement of the Cyclone is. And it is the only military in the world that is using this helicopter in a military application that I'm aware of. I don't think that any other military has taken this civilian Sikorsky helicopter and fitted it out for maritime surveillance role or a military role at all. So it must be said, a mixed safety record in Canada, because this is the same Sikorsky S-92, a modified version of that helicopter, which was involved in a very serious fatal crash off Newfoundland in 2009 in an oil rig service accident when it was being operated by Cougar Airlines. But that particular issue that caused that crash, which was the gearbox, the main gearbox under the rotor running dry, we don't necessarily think that would be the focus of the investigation at this time. It just the circumstances of the crash don't seem to point to that. Sikorsky also was supposed to have made some changes to that particular problem that would make it less likely to reoccur, although there was a back and forth between the Government of Canada and Sikorsky during the procurement of this new helicopter, in which the government did agree to soften some of its requirements. So not to suggest that in any way is connected to this crash. We just do not know the cause of this crash. We don't even know if it was mechanical or not. But certainly people are going to look back at past civilian history with the Sikorsky helicopter. They're going to look at the negotiations of the procurement of this military version, the Cyclone, what requirements the Government of Canada made, what requirements the Government of Canada then dropped or agreed to renegotiate with Sikorsky, and if any of them might have played a role in this crash.
And I just want to let our viewers know we keep showing you, we show you this shot where you can see the Prime Minister there, as well as the Chief of Defence Staff, Harjit Sajjan, the National Defence Minister, as well as other members of the government and the military that are there as we await for this repatriation ceremony to begin. And then we also show you this. And then through those doors, that is where we believe the families are going to emerge for the ceremony to take place. There are hearses there, there are service headdresses, as well as the casket of Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra. And Major, would you walk us through what we're expected to see in the next a few minutes as the families are reunited with either the headgear or, in the case of Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra, the casket?
Well, what's going to happen is the first one off the aircraft will be Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra. Her casket will be brought out first, followed by the headdress on a cushion for Captain Brendan MacDonald, followed by Captain Kevin Hagan, then Captain Maxime Miron-Morin, Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, and Master Corporal Matthew Cousins. In that order, and then the casket and each pillow will be brought to each of the hearses one by one, and the family member of that particular member will be brought to the rear of the hearse to pay their respects.
And Major, what is this moment like? This must be a very difficult moment for families.
It would be. It's also a difficult moment for the military members who are there too. It's we've had when you travel, when you deploy with people such as the Navy, and my time when I was in Bosnia or in the Middle East, these people become another family for you. And so, when you see a situation like this, it brings home the fact that when people serve together, their relationships become very, very hard formed, very important, very significant, and the separation in a situation like this can be very traumatic for everybody. I would suspect that the people in Fredericton right now, in HMCS Fredericton, are feeling very, very emotional about this as well.
Especially, Major, as Evan has been pointing out, we know that there were members on board HMCS Fredericton that witnessed this chopper going down.
That was a traumatic experience, and I suspect that that will be a memory that will live with them for the rest of their lives.
And Evan, just getting back to that, you were talking about the fact that this was a relatively new helicopter, and there were also concerns, correct me if I'm wrong, around, and Major, you might want to weigh in on this as well. Now, we know that this crashed within sight of HMCS Fredericton. It did not crash as it was landing, but within sight. And there were concerns, right, around the maneuverability of this chopper on what is a relatively small landing area on board the ship.
I mean, I think that landing a helicopter on the deck of a moving ship is never going to be a safe operation. And everybody involved in doing that job is well aware of that, and they train very intensely to be able to do it at all. It's probably one of the riskiest jobs in the Canadian military, and it's risky in peacetime because there's never a safe time to land on the deck of a moving ship. And Of course, weather can only compound that. This is not only a new helicopter. The CH-148 Cyclone is still being delivered to the Canadian military. They are still taking delivery of new models of this helicopter, even while the ones that they already have are on operational pause. Canada has ordered, I believe, 28 of these helicopters.
And sorry to interrupt, Evan, I just want to, Major, maybe you can walk us through, this is clearly the moment where members of the families of those fallen, as well as military members, are walking onto the tarmac. Just walk us through what's happening.
Well, they're being walked, they're being escorted out to the point where they will see the remains and the headdress brought from the aircraft, and they will, and then in each case they'll be brought to a hearse, and then a family member for that particular service member will be brought to the back of the hearse to pay their respects. This is, I would say, among the most emotional moments you're going to find for these family members. This is going to be something where they may find it difficult to remain calm, to remain dry-eyed about this. This is a time when they are reunited with their loved ones, with their family members.
All right, let's just go quiet and watch for a bit.
Seconds from now, the final group is going to pass Trudeau. Sorry? I'm just going to stand Trudeau.
I can see, there seems to be about a half a dozen people now brought out.
Okay, and I got Trudeau moving.
I'm just pulling out now for a wider shot as the rest of the group comes.
Yep, gotcha. To Trudeau. I'm going to go wide. Still good shot. I'm going to pan off on a Trudeau. You are?
A sad and solemn afternoon on the tarmac of CFB Trenton in Ontario as we see the families of those honoring their lost loved ones in a helicopter crash 1 week ago off the coast of Greece are emerging from that hangar there. They paid their respect to their lost loved ones. 6 members of the Canadian Armed Forces, members of the Air Force and Navy, as we see them emerge there from the hangar. I want to reintroduce Tim Dunn as part of our coverage. He's a retired major who spent more than 30 years with the Canadian Armed Forces. His deployments included NATO and UN missions. Currently, he's a professor of communication studies at Mount St. Vincent University. So Major Dunn, just your reflections on what we saw take place this afternoon.
Well, it's very poignant, as you pointed out earlier in the broadcast, Andrew. And for 3 of these people, Sub-Lieutenant Cobra, Sub-Lieutenant Pike, and Captain Miron-Morin, this was their first deployment. So it makes it even more poignant when you look at it that way. 3 of them are from Nova Scotia. Sub-Lieutenant Cobra is from where I live in Dartmouth. Sub-Lieutenant Pike is from Truro. And Captain MacDonald is from New Glasgow. So from 3 of them, half of these tragically cases are from Nova Scotia. But it also brings me back to something else that happened 50 years ago. In October 23rd of 1969, HMCS Kootenay was in a naval exercise off the coast of Cape Breton when there was an explosion in the boiler room, and 10 people were killed directly by the explosion, and within a short time, 2 more died from smoke inhalation. It just underscores that the inherent risks sometimes that our military face. These services, I think, are terribly important because it allows us to show the families and the rest and the nation that these people, when they return to Canada, are treated with the dignity, the honor, and the respect that they so richly deserve. In my 37 years in the Armed Forces, I've had the honor and the privilege of working with some of the finest people this nation has produced. And, I have to say that, by all accounts, these 6 young Canadians were as good as any of their predecessors, any of their forebearers. And Canada will be a lesser place without them.
How difficult is this ceremony for families? The moment that either the remains or at least they are honored, the service hats or the casket. There are only one casket. We know the remains of one other, and so there was the repatriation of the service hats of the other members. How challenging is it for their families?
It had to be extremely difficult. I have to confess that I've had some moments this afternoon when I was hard pressed to keep it together as well. These are very emotional events and very difficult for anybody who's ever been in the military or related to someone who's been in the military. The families had to have found it extremely painful. That I would suspect that some of them had some very difficult moments, if not all of them had some very difficult moments during the course of the repatriation ceremony.
We heard the hymn on the bagpipes going home. That is, we heard the hymn on the bagpipes as each member was honored of the hymn going home. I mean, that is often what we hear. We also should point out that the Prime Minister was there, the Governor General, Julie Payette was there, the Chief of Defence Staff, General Vance was there, and other officials were also there. But obviously the focus today is on the families that gathered and honored their lost loved ones behind what we're looking at now, these hearses that are on the tarmac at CFB Trenton. The CBC's Evan Dyer is also watching and listening with us. And Evan, just your thoughts on what we saw.
Well, in the Navy, one of the dangers is not only the inherent risks of being at sea, but it's also been the case in the past, Andrew, that many people who have died at sea have not been recovered. And, Canada has nearly 5,000 war dead from the Battle of the Atlantic, who went down, some of them very close to shore here in Canada. You know, there's the HMCS Esquimalt was sunk in the last days of the war by a U-boat within sight of Halifax Harbor, and some of the people on that ship were never recovered. And you know, anyone who's been in a Canadian war cemetery knows that many of the graves are marked to unknown soldiers because of the difficulties of identifying remains even on land. But at sea, when you go down, it's often very hit or miss whether a person is going to be recovered, and therefore you don't get the same opportunity to visit, you know, the battlefield, the place where it happened, to see anything other than a sort of a shifting ocean, and to know that, you know, your relative is somewhere at the bottom of that. And that's been the case for Canadian war dead in the Navy in many, many instances throughout history, including 4,600 Canadians lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. Many of them never recovered.
And they are saluting as the hearses drive past. Let's just watch. And now, Major Dunn, the ceremony has ended, the repatriation ceremony has ended at CFB Trenton, but the procession continues on what has been known now for some time as the Highway of Heroes, Highway 401, that leads to Toronto. Tell us about what happens now.
Well, along the Highway of Heroes, if what I suspect is being done, the highway will be lined with people who will also pay their respects to these Air Force naval personnel as they pass by, and I think on the Victoria Park overpass, if what I'm told comes through as well, that there'll be a flag for each of these, provincial flag for each of these people, to remember them as well, to commemorate their service.
And Major, picking up on what Evan had to say, can it be more challenging when the remains are not returned?
Well, I think so. I think without a doubt, to not have your family member return home, to be able to put that person to rest close to home, close to family, is very difficult. And I really don't know how to express the sorrow and the pain that the families must feel to simply see a hat or a headdress in the hearse where there should be the person. I think that had to be particularly challenging and particularly difficult for them to accept. I hope that all the remains are recovered, and that all these young people are returned to Canada to be welcomed as they should be and as they so richly deserve to be.
And we just saw, as we watched this procession take place, we just saw the Prime Minister leave, as well as the Governor General, the Minister of National Defence, and many others. We can also tell you that the Prime Minister met privately with the families before the tarmac ceremony began, as we continue to watch what is taking place now off the base as they leave CFB Trenton in Ontario. And Evan, tell us about where we are in this investigation into understanding more of what happened a week ago.
Well, the investigation is still at a fairly early stage, but it does have some of the main elements that it's going to need to come to a conclusion, which are the data recorders designed to detach from a helicopter when it hits the water, as it did in this case. So both the flight data recorder and the voice recorder, which would capture any conversations between the crew in the cockpit, came off the helicopter when it hit the water in the Ionian Sea and were recovered floating in the water. They've now been brought back to Ottawa. They're at the National Research Council. And that data, of course, is going to be minutely analyzed to see what it reveals about this crash. There's also witness statements, because this was witnessed by a number of people on the deck of the Fredericton. The flight signals officer who would be guiding the helicopter in would have been on deck, and other members of the ground crew who would be there to receive it when these helicopters land. I believe that there's a hook attached to them, and ground crew members are waiting for the helicopter, so the ship would be declaring flight stations sometime before the helicopter actually comes back onto the deck, and people who need to be there would be there ready. And we're told that they saw this helicopter plunge into the water within 2 miles of the deck. Those people are now in Toronto, where the ship has docked in Italy, and they're being interviewed by the flight safety investigation team to try to find out if they can shed any light. So those two elements, those eyewitness statements and the electronic data recovered from the flight data recorders, are 2 of 3 elements that you would ideally want to have for an investigation. The third is the wreckage itself. And we did hear General Jonathan Vance talk about a wide debris field that was found by the ships that were searching for the 6 crew members. They would have, we believe, presumably recovered some of that debris. But of course, helicopters being made of metal mostly sink. And this particular helicopter sank in an area of the Mediterranean called the Hellenic Trench, or just at the edge of the Hellenic Trench, which is the deepest part of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, it's not in most places as deep as the great oceans like the Atlantic and the Pacific, but it just so happens that where this particular mission was taking place, it is extremely deep, over 3,000 meters in many places. And that is going to make the recovery of that wreckage, which would also contain important clues probably for the investigators, it's going to be very, very difficult. And if it can't be recovered, then this investigation will have to go forward, missing what is usually a very important element of any air crash investigation.
And Evan and Major Dunn, if you'll just hold on there, I want to bring in Timothy Choi. He is on the editorial board of the Canadian Naval Review. He is also with the Centre for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. And so, Timothy, you watched the ceremony. What did it mean to you? What do you think it meant to the families?
Thanks for having me, Andrew. First of all, I'd like to express my condolences to the families, friends, and shipmates of the crew who went down in Stalker. Really, hopefully my comments will do some justice to their memories. Well, as Tim and Evan have noted, when we commemorate those who perished at sea, we often mention how there are no graves and no markers. And this ceremony, as we're watching it, really brings that home. And since Afghanistan, there hasn't been a single tragedy of this magnitude in the Canadian military. And I hope that their families can at least share, their grief and find some solace with each other, despite the challenges posed by COVID-19 at this time.
And that was something to remark, wasn't it, Major Dunn, as you saw? We'll be forever probably reminded of this ceremony in that sense, just seeing everybody wearing a mask and just how unusual that was. Major Dunn, I'm not sure whether you're still connected, but we had, Major Dunn, I just wanted you to reflect on, what Timothy was mentioning just about how this is, unusual in the time that we're seeing people wearing masks on the tarmac, and it is one of the deadliest incidents in modern Canadian military history.
It certainly is, and I look at this and I think go back to the time of the Kootenays accident in 1969, and then the 148 military deaths in Afghanistan, another diplomat, and 3 civilians who were killed. So military service does have its risks, its inherent risks, and its dangers. To see people lost at sea is a difficult matter. People may never have that comfort of being able to visit their loved ones or family members at a gravesite, and that too is another tragedy.
And Timothy Troy, we had the repatriation ceremony here at home, but there's still a recovery operation underway off the coast of Greece. Can you tell us about the mission the crew was involved in?
Right, so there are basically three main contexts in which the Frederick Trenton was deployed. And firstly is that they're there as part of Standing NATO Maritime Group 2, and it's one of 4 NATO permanent standing fleets that are available at a moment's notice at a level of high readiness to respond to any kind of acute emergencies, while also conducting everyday chronic deterrence and presence missions. And the second part of this is the Canadian component, which is Operation Reassurance, and that's a Canadian contribution to the overall NATO deterrence and assurance mission in the aftermath of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so Frederick Trenton is deployed with SNMNG, the Standing NATO Maritime Group, as part of Operation Reassurance, and they have been operating in the Mediterranean and Black Seas to assure NATO members and warn Russia that NATO warships are ready at a moment's notice to respond to any crisis if necessary. And then finally, and perhaps this is the one that gets the least amount of attention, is what we call General Maritime Security Operations. And navies are interesting and a unique branch of the armed forces in that they function as essentially emergency services on the high seas during peacetime. For example, there are no ambulances or fire departments that civilians can call when you're in the middle of the ocean. So naval ships often play that emergency response role. For example, if your boat catches on fire, it may well be a Navy frigate who sends sailors over wearing firefighting gear. And if somebody on board your ship is hurt, a medic or doctor from a patrolling warship might be more likely to come to your assistance than a civilian doctor, thousands of kilometers away. And if there are people, drugs, or weapons being smuggled, it's not always the RCMP or its regional equivalent who will be pulling you over, confiscating that contraband. It'll often be a Navy or Coast Guard ship, depending on the country and the region of the world. And of course, to be able to provide these emergency and security services, navies have to be really familiar with the routines of that region that they're in. They have to build a baseline normal picture so they can easily see what isn't normal, and therefore be able to identify these abnormalities and check those out. And so it takes a lot of unique work and a lot of high-tech skills to build this picture across the broad expanses of the ocean.
And I just want to bring back the CBC's Evan Dyer. Just your final thoughts on what we have been watching today and where we are in the investigation.
Well, everything Timothy just said is very true, and that and Canada has seen Operation Reassurance as one of its most important commitments around the world. Ever since it began, it's been 6 years now. There's always been a Canadian presence in the maritime component of Operation Reassurance. There are land forces there too in Latvia, which Canada intends to keep. And there's also an air patrol component in the Baltic. So this is a mission that the Canadian military took very, very seriously, and it appears intends to continue with. It's been tough, though, to watch this funeral. And of course, for the Fredericton, you can only imagine for the crew if they continue their deployment. This is going to be the thing that they remember from it always. And watching them coming home like that, just in the form of their wedge caps and peaked cap in the case of Lieutenant Matthew Pike, that's particularly tough, I imagine, for the families. This ceremony was never going to be easy, but two things made it harder. Mm-hmm. One is only having the identified remains of one of the victims. One family probably will yet be able to have remains, but there are 4 that we can probably expect never will. And then, of course, the other thing that makes it tougher is COVID-19. And just very poignant to see Captain McDonald's children there in masks, reaching out for the door of the hearse. Very poignant.
Mm-hmm. It sure was. Major Dunn, just your thoughts as we continue to watch. This is now moving on towards leaving CFB Trenton, moving on to the road, and then on to the Highway of Heroes, Highway 401, on its way to Toronto. Final thoughts from you, sir?
My only thoughts are that of sympathy for the families, and my thoughts for the crew members, the colleagues, the friends, the associates of those who were killed. That has been also very difficult. I remember some of the situations we had when I was deployed to Bosnia, where we've lost one of our soldiers at one time or another, and had the incredible impact that had on everybody around us, whether we knew them personally or not. The impact was phenomenal, and we always had a very somber a moment when we return those people back to home.
And what do you make of this, that it's happening during this pandemic, Major Dunn?
Well, it makes it all the more difficult because, of course, the people can't associate. They even on board the ship, I was talking with one of the people with the Air Force this morning, and she reminded me that, of course, because of COVID, no one was able to get to a port visit. So they were confined to the ship for the duration of the time that they were deployed since COVID-19 began, which made that sense of community, that sense of comradeship, of family, even more strong. And so that has to also make the 6 deaths all the more difficult to accept.
And then, Major Dunn, the interviews could be taking place with members who witnessed this crash, right? And that could continue.
Indeed, it can. In fact, I'll be speaking with the Director of Flight Safety tomorrow related to this, just to understand what happens in a flight safety investigation when there is an accident. What are they looking for, and what are the results of an investigation of this sort?
And Timothy Choi, just your thoughts on that? What would be taking place now when it comes to the investigation?
Well, right now, geez, it's hard to really say the right words. I just heard from a colleague of mine who's here at CMSS here in Calgary, and she has friends on board Frederick right now, so I can only imagine what they're feeling. Fredericton, in terms of investigation, it's well, I can remind you, at least highlight what the helicopter was doing and its crew during this particular flight. It's a lot of times, I know some people are going to be wondering why, for a helicopter with a crew of 4, why there are 2 extra, naval personnel on board. Well, quite frankly, you need both, a helicopter and a ship. They're a closely integrated entity. And in order for the ship to actually understand the capabilities of the helicopters, they need to, the ship's crew also needs to be familiar with what the limits of the helicopter is. And so on board, you have those 2 naval officers who were there to really help familiarize themselves with the capabilities of this helicopter and try to figure out, when to use it, when not to use it. And so all of this, while you're trying to compile that picture of what's happening in the Ionian Sea, to maintain that maritime domain awareness, to build that picture of what's normal and what's not. And certainly in this particular time of COVID-19, you have a dramatic change in, the social activities that are going on the water. And so unlike perhaps the usual times, you can't really leverage existing, past baseline pictures of the region. You have to build them up basically from scratch, or at least a lot more work that you have to do to operate in that area than in the past. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Timothy Choi, Major Tim Dunn, and the CBC's Evan Dyer, thank you all very much.